Godfrey Higgins, Anacalypsis. We're going to be in chapter 3 on this one, which is the sun, the first object of adoration of all nations, the gods, not deceased heroes. The Chinese have only one god, Hindu goddesses, and the toleration and change in religions. Okay, so Godfrey Higgins goes really deep. Again, this book was not even released until after his death. Okay, what was released beforehand was the Celtic Druids, which we'll be going into at a later point. But I want to read, again, just bits and pieces. We're not going to dive into every little thing. If you want to dive into this book and do some search and research on your own, I think it'd be highly beneficial, because you can find exactly what you're looking for within the book, or parameters in which Godfrey Higgins has spoke about. So it says, on the first view of the mythological systems of the Gentiles, the multitude of their gods appeared to be infinite, and the confusion inextricable. But if a person will only consider the following chapters carefully and without prejudice, he will probably discover a system which, in some degree, will unravel their intricacies, will reconcile their apparent contradictions, will explain the general meaning of their mysteries, and will show the reason why, among the various religions in later times, toleration so universally prevailed. Now it says here on number 2, it has until lately been the general opinion that the gods of the ancients were nothing but the heroes or the benefactors of mankind, living in very illiterate and remote ages, to whom a grateful posterity paid divine honors. This appears at first sight to be probable, and as it has served the purpose of the Christian priests to enable them to run down the religion of the ancients, and, in exposing its absurdities, to contrast it disadvantageously with their own, it has been, and continues to be, sedulously inculcated in every public and private seminary. The generality of schoolmasters know no better. They teach what they have learned and what they believe. But as this rank of men increase in talent and learning, this is gradually wearing away. Okay, so you see, as those who have been indoctrinated into a certain belief, they look deeper and find out that there's so many problems, and then it starts to wear away and we find the truth of what is real. He says, although the pretended worship of heroes appears at first sight plausible, very little depth of thought or learning is requisite to discover that it has not much foundation in truth. It was not in the infant state of society that men were worshipped. It was not, on the contrary, until they arrived at a very high and advanced state of civilization. It was not Moses, Zoroaster, Confucius, Socrates, Solon, Plato, Pythagoras, or Numa that were objects of worship. The benefactors of mankind in all ages have been oftener persecuted than worshipped. No divine honors, if such they can be called, were reserved for Alexander of Macedon, the drunkard, for Augustus Caesar, the hypocrite, or Heliogabalus, the lunatic. A species of civil adoration despised by all persons of common understanding, and essentially different from the worship of the Supreme Being, was paid to them. It was the vice of the movement, and soon passed away. How absurd to suppose that the elegant and enlightened Athenian philosopher could worship Hercules because he killed a lion, or cleaned a stable, or Bacchus, because he made wine, or got drunk. Besides, these deified heroes can hardly be called gods in any sense. They were more like the Christian saints. Thus we have Divus Augustus, and Divus Paulus, and Divus Petrus. Their nature has been altogether misunderstood and will afterward be explained. After a life of the most painful and laborious research, Mr. Bryant's opinion is that all of the various religions terminated in the worship of the sun. He commences his work by showing, from a great variety of etymological proofs, that all the name of the deities were derived or compounded from some word which originally meant the sun. Let's read that one more time. He commences his work by showing from a great variety of etymological proofs that all the names of the deities were derived or compounded from some word which originally meant the sun. Notwithstanding the ridicule which has been thrown upon etymological inquiries in consequence of the want of fixed rules, or of the absurd length to which some persons have carried them, yet I am quite certain it must, in a great measure, be from etymology at last that we must recover the lost learning of antiquity. And what I love about this so much is that it reminds me about a lot of our people who do look into the etymology of certain things, such as my boy, Dr. Longo. Dr. Longo, over there in Old World, Florida, looking at, again, the etymological relationships, ties, references, the same way in which, or the same meanings of the words, or the same sounds, phonetics of the words, which break down to one meaning, or the original source of meaning itself. It says, Diodorus Siculus says that it was the belief of the ancients that Osiris, Serapis, Dionysus, Pluto, Jupiter, and Pan were all one. Ausonius represents all the deities to be included under the term Dionysus, Dionysus. Sometimes Pan was called the god of all, sometimes Jupiter. Nonus also states that all the different gods, whatever might be their names, Hercules, Ammon, Apollo, or Mithra, centered in the sun. Mr. Selden says, whether they be called Osiris, or Omphis, or Nelis, or Cyrus, or by any other name, they all centered in the sun, the most ancient deity of the nations. Basnage says that Osiris, that famous god of the Egyptians, was the sun, or rather the sun was an emblem of the beneficent god Osiris. Serapis was another name for the sun. Ramesius gives an inscription to Jupiter the sun, the invincible Serapis. Mithras was likewise the sun, or rather was but a different name, which the Persians bestowed on the Egyptian Osiris. Hippocrates also represented the sun. It is true, he was also the god of silence. He put his finger upon his mouth because the sun was worshipped with the reverential silence, and thence came the siege of the siege of Basilidians, who had their origin from Egypt. By the Syrians, the sun and heat were called the Khme, Chamma, Chamha, and by the Persians, Hama. Thus, the temple to which Alexander so madly marched in the desert was called the Temple of the Sun, or of Ammon. Mr. Bryant shows that Ham was esteemed the Zeus of Greece and the Jupiter of Latium. Did you hear that? Mr. Bryant shows that Ham, that old good famous Ham that everybody wants to talk about, was esteemed the Zeus of Greece and the Jupiter of Latium. Okay? Ham, subjovis nomine in Africa, cultus. Mr. Bryant says, the worship of Ham, or the sun, as it was the most ancient, so it was the most universal in the world. It was at first the prevailing religion of Greece, and was propagated all over the sea coast of Europe, from whence it extended itself into the inland provinces. It was established in Gaul and Britain, and was the original religion of this island, which the Druids, in after times, adopted. This Ham was nothing but a Greek corruption of a very celebrated Indian word, formed of the three letters AUM, of which I shall have much to say hereafter. The Let's read that again. This Ham was nothing but a Greek corruption of the very celebrated Indian word formed of the three letters AUM, of which I shall have much to say hereafter. It also appears from the Scholia in Horace, that Apollo and Dionysus were the same. In fact, they were all three the same, the sun. Coming back down here on page 46, he says, Jupiter is the king. Jupiter himself is the original source of all things. There is one power, one God, and one great ruler over all. But we have seen that Jupiter and all the other gods, were but names for the sun. Therefore it follows that the sun, either as emblem or as God himself, was the object of universal adoration. The heathens, even in the later days of their idolatry, were not so gross in their notions, but that they believed there was only one supreme God. They did indeed worship a multitude of deities, but they supposed all but one to be the subordinate deities. They always had a notion of one deity superior to all the powers of heaven, and all the other deities were conceived to have different offices or ministrations under him, being appointed to preside over elements, over cities, over countries, and to dispense victory to armies, health, life, and other blessings in their favorites, if permitted by the supreme power. Hesiod supposes one god to be the father of the other deities. Dr. Shuckford has shown that the Egyptians originally worshipped the supreme god under the name Seneth, affirming him to be without beginning or end. Philobiblius says that they represented him by the figure of a serpent with the head of a hawk in the middle of a circle. Certainly a very mythological emblem, but then he represents them to have given to this being all the attributes of the supreme God, the creator, incorruptible and eternal. Now, this is pretty crazy because on this next one, we're talking about Porphyry, right? And he had a name which was for the maker or creator of the universe. Now, the opinion entertained by Porphyry may be judged of from the following extract. Quote, "We will sacrifice," says he, "but in a manner that is proper, bringing choice victims with the choicest of our faculties, burning and offering to God, who, as a wise man observed, is above all nothing sensual, for nothing is joined to matter, which is not impure, and therefore incongruous to a nature free from the contagion belonging to matter, for which reason neither speech, which is produced by the voice, nor even internal or mental language, if it be infected with any disorder of the mind, is proper to be offered to God, but we worship God with an unspotted silence in the most pure thoughts of his nature." Unquote. So that's pretty deep, right? They had a whole way of thinking about sacrifice. Now, I ain't got, no really true opinion of whether it's right or wrong. It's, to me, I look at it as why were they doing it and what was their beliefs behind it, right? Right here, I wanted to highlight this because it says Rome being built around Anno Mundi 3256. But you know what? I'm going to dive back to the top of this paragraph here. It says, Shuckford says, "But if we look into Italy, we not only find in general that the writers of their antiquities remark that their ancient deities were of a different sort from those of Greece, but according to Plutarch, Numa, the second king of Rome, made express orders against the use of images in the worship of the deity. Nay, he says further that the first 170 years after the building of the city, the Romans used no images, but thought the deity invisible, and reputed it unlawful to make representations of him from things of an inferior nature, so that, according to this account, Rome being built about Anno Mundi 3256, the inhabitants were not greatly corrupted in their religion, even so late as Anno Mundi 3426, which falls when Nebuchadnezzar was king of Babylon, and about 169 years after the time where I am to end this work. It is remarkable that Plutarch does not represent Numa as correcting or refining the ancient idolatry of Italy, but expresses that this people never had these grosser deities, either before or for the first 170 years of their city, so that it is more than probable that Greece was not thus corrupted when the Pelasgi were moved from thence into Italy, and further, that the Trojans were not such idolaters at the destruction of their city, because according to this account, Aeneas neither brought with him images into Italy, nor such gods as were worshipped by the adoration of images, and therefore Pausanias, who imagined that Aeneas carried the Palladium into Italy, was as much mistaken as the men of Argos, who affirmed themselves to have it in their city. The times of Numa are about 200 years after Homer, and very probably the idolatry so much celebrated in his writings might by this time begin to appear in Italy, and thereby occasioned Numa to make laws and constitutions against it. Right here it says on number 6, the Chinese, with all their apparent idolatry, had only one God. Now it says, speaking of the religion of the Chinese, Sir W. Jones says, quote, of the religion's opinions entertained by Confucius and his followers, we may glean a general notion from the fragments of their works translated by Couplet. They professed a firm belief in the supreme God and gave a demonstration of his being and of his providence, from the exquisite beauty and perfection of the celestial bodies and the wonderful order of nature in the whole fabric of the visible world. From this belief they deduced a system of ethics which the philosopher sums up in a few words. At the close of the Lun Yin, he, says Confucius, who shall be fully persuaded that the Lord of heaven governs the universe, who shall in all things choose moderation, who shall perfectly know his own species, and so act among them, that his life and manners may conform to his knowledge of God and man, may be truly said to discharge all the duties of a sage, and to be exalted above the common herd of the human race. Marco Polo informs us that in his time the Chinese paid their adoration to a tablet fixed against the wall in their houses, upon which was inscribed the name of the high celestial and supreme God, to whose honor they burnt incense, but of whom they had no image. The words, Mr. Marsden says, which were on the tablet were 3 Tien, heaven, Hoang Tien, supreme heaven, and Shang Ti, sovereign Lord. The Guinness tells us that the word Tien stands indifferently for the visible heaven and the supreme deity. Marco Polo tells us that from the God whose name was on the tablet, the Chinese only petitioned for 2 things, sound intellect and health of body, but that they had another God, of whom they had a statue or idol called Natagai. Natagai. You see that? Natigai. Natagai, who was the God of all terrestrial things. In fact, God, the creator of this world, inferior and subordinate to the Supreme Being, from whom they petition for fine weather or whatever else they want, a sort of mediator. Here is evidently a striking similarity to the doctrines of some of the early Christian heretics. So you see, we got some ties going on, right? You can kind of tell what's going on. So they had the lower deity of this world, the creator of this world, but that's not the supreme. And you know what this kind of ties into is the understanding of when we look into, and we'll look into it at a later point. It's a very lengthy book, but the Urantia book, and the understanding of the higher orders, the lower orders and the higher orders of things that are above and below us. And that's not necessarily the supreme, but just an emanation of the supreme itself working under. Okay? Continuing, it says, it seems pretty clear from this account that originally, and probably at this time also, like all the ancients of the West in the midst of their degrading idolatry, they yet acknowledged one supreme God, with many subordinate agents, precisely the same as the heathens of Greece and Rome, and modern Christians, under the names of inferior gods, angels, demons, saints, etc. In fact, they were deists. Continuing on, it says, right here we're on whoever will read the Gita with attention will perceive in that small tract the outlines of nearly all the various systems of theology in Asia. That curious and ancient doctrine of the Creator being both male and female, mentioned in a preceding page to be designated in Indian temples by very indecent exhibition of the masculine and feminine organs of generation and union, occurs in the following passages. Quote, I am the father and mother of this world. I plant myself upon my own nature and create again and again this assemblage of beings. I am generation and dissolution. the place where all things are deposited, and the inexhaustible seed of all nature. I am the beginning, the middle, and the end of all things. In another part, he more directly says, quote, the great Brahme is the womb of all, whose various forms which are conceived in every natural womb, and I am the father that soweth the seed, unquote. Herodotus informs us that the Persian Mithras was the same with the Assyrian Venus, Mylitta, or Aphrodita Arania, by which was meant the creating deity. It is well known that the Venus Aphrodite was a Phoenician deity, worshipped particularly at Citium, and was both the male and female gender, the Venus Genetrix. Proclus describes Jupiter in one of the Orphic hymns to be both male and female, hermaphroditic, and Bishop Synesius adopts it in a Christian hymn. The Priapus of the Etruscans was both male and female. He was the membrum varioli, with the female breasts. Jupiter is a man. Jupiter is also an immortal maid. In the same commentary, in the same page, we read that all things were contained in the womb of Jupiter. Number 8 says, Manichaeus, according to Theodoret, said, in his allegorical language, quote, that a male virgin gave life to Eve, that is, created her, and the pseudo-Mercurius Themistigistus in Parmander said that God, being male and female, because he is light and life, engendered by the word another intelligence, which was the creator. The male virgin, Theodoret says, was called Joel, which Barasobre thinks was El, God. Johah, life-making, vivifying, life-giving, or the generating God, unquote. So far, my friend Beverly, but which was probably merely the Al, or God, Al, of which we shall treat hereafter. Again, Mr. Beverly says, quote, in Genesis it is written, God said, let us create man after our image and likeness, unquote. This, then, ought in strictness of language to be a male and female God, or else it would not be after the likeness proposed. The male virgin of the Orientals is, I know, considered the same by Plato as his Isa, or Isia, or Vesta, whom he calls the soul of the body of the universe. This Hestia, by the way, is in my view a Sanskrit lady, whose name I take to have been est, or she that is, or exists, having the same meaning as the great name of the Jewish deity. Est is shown in the Celtic Druids to be a Sanskrit word, and I do not doubt of this, her derivation. We go on to say down here, it says, Apuleius makes the mother of the gods of the masculine gender and represents her, describing herself as called Minerva at Athens, Venus at Cyprus, Diana at Crete, Proserpine in Sicily, Ceres in Eleusis, in other places Juno, Bellona, Hecate, Isis, etc. And if any doubt could remain, the philosopher Porphyry, than whom probably no one was better skilled in these matters, removes it by acknowledging that Vesta, Re, Ceres, Themis, Priapus, Proserpine, Bacchus, Attis, Adonis, Selenius, and the Satyrs were all the same. He says, Valerius calls Jupiter the mother of the gods. Coming down here, it says, and the two of the Orphic fragments, in all that has been said above, seems to be comprehended. This deity, like the others, is said to be of two genders, and to be also the sun. Mr. Bryant says, it is a masculine name for a feminine deity, and means divine wisdom. I suspect it was a corruption of the Maya, or Mia, of India. In Cyprus, Venus is represented with a beard, and called Aphrodite. Jupiter is called feminine, and the Genetrixque Diem by Augustine. The Orphic verses make the moon both male and female. Now, he goes on to say here, in a part of this work I shall have much more to say of the goddess, or the female generative power, which became divided from the male, and in consequence was the cause of the great wars and miseries in the eastern parts of the world, and of the rise of a number of sects in the western, which have not been all understood. Thus we see there is a fact and an end of all multitude of the heathen gods and goddesses so distinguished in the pantheons and books of various kinds, which the priests have published from time to time to install in the minds of their pupils, that the ancient heathen philosophers and legislators were the slaves of the most degrading superstition, that they believed such nonsense as the metamorphosis described by Ovid, or the loves of Jupiter, Venus, etc., etc., that the rabble were the victims of a degrading superstition, I have no doubt. This was produced by the knavery of the ancient priest, and it is in order to reproduce this effect that the modern priests have misrepresented the doctrines of their predecessors. They're all the way off. They're completely off. They're not even representing the correct doctrines, y'all. By vilifying and running down the religion of the ancients, they have thought that they could persuade their votaries that their new religion was necessary for the good of mankind, a religion which, in consequence in the corruptions, has been found to be in practice much worse and more injurious to the interests of society than the old one. For, from these corruptions, the Christian religion, the religion of purity and truth when uncorrupted, has not brought peace, but a sword. Has not brought peace, but a sword. So on this next little piece right here that I'm about to read, this is something that's pretty cool because, recently I've been really thinking about time and how time is, an illusion. How there is no past, there is no present. Well, there is a present, but there is no future, right? Everything is in the existence of now, the ever omni-existence of now, and always has been. So if you can put yourself into the understanding that everything is now, but that there is motion in the now, the motion is what we would define, or the change, right? The motion that brings about change is what we would classify as time, but everything exists now in this very moment. So it says, the law of perpetual motion is universal. We know that no such thing is absolute rest. Causes over which man has no control overturn and change his wisest institutions. Mr. Du Bois, in his first chapter, has shown that probably all nations first worshipped, as we are told the Persians did, without altars or temples, in groves and high places. After a certain number of years in Persia came temples and idols, with all their abuses. And these, in their turn, were changed or abolished, and the worship of the sun restored, or perhaps the worship of the sun only as an emblem of the Creator. This was probably the change said to have been effected by Zoroaster. It says, the Israelites at the Exodus had evidently run into the worship of Apis the bull, or the golden calf of Egypt, which it was the object of Moses to abolish, and in the place thereof to substitute the worship of one God, Ael, Jehovah, which, in fact, was the only sun or the solar fire, yet not the sun as creator, but as emblem of, or the Shekinah of the divinity. The Canaanites, according to the Mosaic account, were not idolaters in the time of Abraham, but it is implied that they became so in the long space between the time he lived and that of Moses. The Assyrians seem to have become idolaters early, and not, as the Persians, to have any reformer like Zoroaster or Moses, but to have continued till the iconoclasts, Cyrus and Darius, reformed them with fire and sword, as their successor Cambyses soon afterward did the Egyptians. The observations made on the universality of the solar worship contain but very little of what might be said respecting it, but yet enough is to be said to establish the fact. If the reader wish for more, his curiosity will be amply repaid by a perusal of Mr. Bryant's analysis of the heathen mythology. He may also read the 4th chapter of Cudworth's intellectual system, which is a most masterly performance. So diving into that, the next thing we're going to be diving into is the two ancient Ethiopias. Uh-oh. The East and the West, baby. And we ain't talking about Ethiopia as a country. We're talking about a race of people, which is the great black nation in Asia. Uh-oh. The Buddha of India, a Negro. Uh-oh. The Arabians were Cushites. Memnon, shepherd kings. Hindus and Egyptians, similar. Syria, people from India. Okay? So, we'll be going over this on the next one. That's why I say this Anacalypsis by Godfrey Higgins is really, really good, just due to the fact that he's breaking it all down and saying it straight up. He's not trying to, hide anything. He's just really real with it. And I think that's what is very important. So, I hope y'all enjoyed this one. This is going to be Anacalypsis, a deep dive into it. And, yeah, y'all, we're going to see y'all for the next one, all right? Peace and blessings. We love you all. All right.